Welcome, everyone. This is the procurement training for HOME-ARP, and this is going to be kind of a really thorough subject. It's going to be a little deep, so it is recorded, and so you'll be able to access it post-training if you need to. Many times if you need to. This is something that you can probably even apply to other types of federal funding. It's not anything that's just for this. So yeah, so it's going to be super interesting. A little bit of the basic stuff. One is, if none of you have your videos on, which is great. Not that we don't want to see your lovely faces. It just helps with the video to be less, there's not as much memory involved because there's not many videos involved. So that's great. 2, ask your questions. Kelly and I talked before the meeting and really discussed how it's intense stuff. And so if you have questions, ask them in the chat. We will go ahead and interrupt her, raise your hand, and we will unmute you. So for the most part, we're going to try and keep you guys muted just to keep the background noise at a minimum. But definitely raise those hands, clap if you want, have big questions, any angry faces, anything like that. Feel free to emote as much as you want in the midst of this particular conversation. And before we get started too, what I wanted to do is we have our calendar for the non-congregate shelter grant ready. The calendar's on site. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly walk through this with you so you can all access it. This is going to be our application site. So just keep watching this particular arena. So I'm going to share my screen and I hope you all can see it. It may be a smaller, I should have probably done it in a different area, but that's okay. So when you go onto the DCA website, see HOME-ARP, you can just type in HOME-ARP there. Go ahead and press search. And the American Rescue Plan HOME-ARP program comes right up. This is our page, okay? Scroll down to non-congregate shelter and the DCA HOME-ARP NCS application page. Super easy. And so here's the application information and here's the updated calendar essentially. The plan is to publish the application on the 15th. So next Thursday, a week from today. We're really big on Thursdays with this particular program. I don't know why, it just came up. And so go ahead and take a look at this. This is going to have all of the connections for you to go ahead and sign up for and register for those trainings. And just a quick overview for those of you who may not have participated in the application basics webinar. We're going to take our application into more of a capacity building format. So what we're going to do is we're going to have about 8 different application pieces that we're going to walk through with trainings. And so, and that includes data and SWOT analysis to help you guys prepare, looking at your budgets to make sure that you'd be able to support non-congregate shelter if you are able to build one. Trying to develop those construction pieces and talking about federal labor and things, which is a part of this whole thing because this is a federal program. So, and then our hope is that once you are done with all the fun with us, you can take all the information and bring it into the other grants that you apply for and other funding things that you apply for, and you actually have banked essentially all the documentation you need for not only this grant, but many, many more. So, or it's a good baseline for you that you can keep adding to through the years. So that is our goal, to help you. We don't want this to be a stagnant process. We want it to be something that you can, take and build off of. So literally, so you could build, we're all about building buildings and building capacities. So So that is that. Please take a look. Please keep updated on this. I'm going to continue to send out those. Oh, let me go back to the main page here. Also down here at the bottom, sign up for our mailing list. I know I told you all that we were going to have a separate mailing list for the application. We're just going to scrap that and send it to everyone on the mailing list. If you've already signed up for the mailing list, don't worry about re-signing up. If you already signed up for the application mailing list, don't worry about signing up for this if you haven't already. I'm just going to include that one. I just was thinking about, we were talking and I was like, I'm making this way too difficult. So we simplified the whole thing. So then that way it's easier for y'all to access. So here's the website. If you have not signed up for the waiting list, I'm assuming you have since you're all here, or if you need someone to sign up for the waiting list, tell them where to look and we'll be right there. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. And again, if you guys have any questions in the middle, stop us, please raise those hands, go in the chat. We're going to be monitoring, Jody and I are going to be monitoring the chat the whole time. And so Jody, actually, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? By the way, everyone, my name is Lona Nagy and I'm one of the two ARP specialists. And so Jody, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then we'll turn it on over to Kelly.
Hey, my name is Jody Key and I'm one of the compliance specialists. Alona's the guru of non-congregate shelter and I will be dealing with the LIHTC side. So yeah, and here is our wonderful manager, Kelly Evans.
That was a great introduction. Thank you very much. I'm Kelly Evans. I'm the HOME-ARP manager. This is not the HOME-ARP allocation plan. I did not change the first slide. I will change it before we get it put up on the website. But this is the review of the procurement standards. And so this is going to be a lot. And I want y'all to be able to ask questions as we go, because once we move past something, it's hard to go back with procurement. Procurement is a very complicated issue. So we're going to go through 2 CFR 200 is the standard on how you manage money that is federal dollars. And in there is a subsection that is section 317 to 326. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But anytime you hear anybody say 2 CFR 200, they're talking about compliance around how you manage federal dollars. Here's our disclaimer. This is for training purposes. You should always refer to 2 CFR 200 and any additional federal official guidance. Those guidances are going to come from OMB. And that is really important that you make sure that you have checked both 2 CFR 200 as well as OMB. The go-to people for this industry-wise are going to be your accountants, your fee accountant, any accountant that has a government training is going to know what 2 CFR is, and they're also going to be watching those OMB circulars that come out. So it's really important that you know those 2 concepts.
Kelly, we have a hand up. So Rachel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Allow mic. Okay. You should be allowed. Allow mic. Rachel, do you have a question, or put in the chat if you have a question or not?
Yeah, that's also an option.
I'm unable to unmic you right now. It may be on your end because I'm allowing your mic.
And you can always hit the space bar and hold it to unmute yourself.
There you go. Okay. Why don't you keep going ahead, Rachel? I see that you have something come up, so either put it in the chat or, oh, she put her hand down, so we're good. Okay.
Cool.
Thanks.
All right. So where's the procurement guidance located? I'm basing this off of the multifamily housing program financial management tool. I will tell you that the dollar amounts in this have not been updated since the circular came out in August of 2020. And since HUD integrated that in the fall of 2020. But it is a really good basic understanding toolkit in layman's language. That QR code will take you straight to it. So you want to take a minute and snap that. But we'll also put this up on the website. So there are some exceptions under the HOME-ARP statute. I listed them here. We're not going to get into them because it really truly this comes after the award. But I wanted to make sure that you knew that under the statute, Congress put in these exceptions to help facilitate. This is an incredibly flexible grant in terms of both federal grants as well as HUD grants. And so they took out or made some exceptions to sections on purpose to try to improve flexibility. Okay, so what does that mean? What's left? The uniform standards for procurement are for all HUD awardees and can be found at 2 CFR 200, and then the subsections 317 through 326. This is just the procurement sections.
Kelly, real quick.
Sure.
The question that Rachel had was for those who are not purchasing land or just for purchasing. So I think if you could talk about kind of the purchasing aspect and what it really means real quick, and I think you may be going into this. So that's coming, but maybe it's kind of for a big group of things. So it's not just for land. So correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a really important concept because this doesn't matter what you're procuring. Okay. You can be procuring, paper clips. You can be procuring a $10 million development. Okay. As long as it is under one contract and that falls under procurement, this is where this kicks in. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what triggers different things, because it's not what you're procuring that matters, it's how much it costs. And so that's when you start talking about land and procuring larger items, that's one of the reasons why they don't specify what you're procuring. They want to make sure that when you are procuring under this dollar value or over that dollar value, that you are doing it in this way. So what does that mean? All right, well, it means that it has to be a full and open competition. That is mandatory. The more transparent, the more in the sunshine your process is, the better. You will find that is what you are. If you have someone go to court with you, that is the highest standard that you are going to be held to. Was it an open, fair, and transparent competition? You must have a conflict of interest and procurement policy in place. It is incredibly important that you have your board approve these so that the board understands that they are subject to conflict of interest rules, as well as the procurement policy. Obviously, they don't want you duplicating or having unnecessary cost. You can only award contracts to a responsible contractor. Towards the end of the presentation, we'll talk about what that means. Contractors that develop all of this process for the bid packet cannot bid on whatever it is you are purchasing. So if you're going to be in the process of managing it, you're managing the process, you can't bid. If you want to bid, don't manage the process for the nonprofit. You have to maintain documentation and records, and that's going to include screenshots. It's going to include printouts, PDFs, pictures, handwritten notes, but you have to document. If you don't document something, it did not happen. Okay. They add emphasis about being careful with interlocal governmental agreements. They are under, especially in the state of Georgia, you can piggyback off of other people's procurement process. So if your Board of Education has procured, copiers, for example, and you want to piggyback off of that copier, procurement, you're allowed to. However, they want to make sure that you understand that you are then accepting their procurement process and that they have met the standards. So you can't just say, oh, they have a contract. Great, let me go buy. You have to have all of their contract documents, look at them, say, yes, this meets our procurement standard, and yes, we are going to purchase off of their contract. I would dissuade you from doing that in the case of the HOME-ARP grant. It's a new grant. You're going to find it's very difficult to make sure that it's apples to apples if you use another governmental agency's previous purchase process. So, and they want you to make sure that you define clearly the time and material contracts, because there are labor standards that you have to meet in this process. And we're not going to talk about labor standards right now, but I will tell you that Section 3 is a labor requirement under HOME-ARP, and we're going to have additional webinars about those kinds of issues. We got any questions, Alana, while I'm transitioning? Okay. Good,
No,
because
we're
not
clear
gonna
right
make-
now. But also just to let everyone know, I changed the settings, so we should be able to unmute you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So what are the requirements? There are categories of procurement, okay, and they differ. So it's very important that you understand what is a micro purchase, what is a small purchase, and what triggers a sealed bid. All of these are base values. There are examples in the legislation that you can request that your micro purchase level be up to a higher amount. It was moved to 10,000 in August of 2020-ish, about that time. All right, so if it's less than $10,000, it's a micro purchase. If it's between 10,000 and 250,000, it's a small purchase. If it's 250,000 or greater, it's a sealed bid. And if you're questioning whether or not it falls from one category to the other, always go with the greater category to make sure you cover yourself, because the higher the cost, the more compliance is required. Okay, so what are micro
Kelly?
purchases? Yeah.
Just real quick, do you have any samples of conflict and procurement policies that can be made available, or know where they can be found?
Let's make a note of that and let me pull some stuff, and we'll
Okay.
put it up on the website. Because I asked about whether or not we had anything internally, and I don't think we have like a repository of previous documents, but the CHIP grant has these same requirements, and LaTanya may have them. So if you'll make a note, then we'll put some of this stuff together. It's just examples. We're not gonna, DCA is very careful about making sure that we do not promote or sign off on anything. They're just example of local governments. And then it's the responsibility of whoever chooses to adopt it and their board to make sure that their attorney reviews it for completeness. Okay. I had to get the disclaimer in there.
Absolutely.
Micro purchases. So micro purchases are anything under $10,000. When you have a micro purchase, it's important that you understand that the OMB circulars and 2 CFR 200 discourage you. And when I say discourage, I mean with capital letters and an exclamation point. Do not try to push everything under one bid amount, or to break things up into smaller amounts to get under and over thresholds. Okay, it's really, really important that if you are getting ready to procure something for $15,000, don't break it up into 3 procurements for $5,000 a piece and think that that's okay. It's not. Okay, you have to make sure that your scope of what you're doing is reasonable and that it encompasses what you're trying to do. Because if you break a bid up to get it under a threshold to avoid having to do a full procurement, you're going to get an audit finding and you may be subject to recapture on the funds. So you start out, what is the scope of what I'm trying to accomplish here? Every procurement has a scope of service on it. It should. It should be a written paragraph that basically says, at minimum says, this is what I'm procuring. This is the quantity. This is the description of the items. This is, you know, the shipping that we expect on it, tax, tag, and title. This is what we are going to solicitation for. Okay. And then if it's under $10,000, you can get those solicitations or bids. They can be written or they can be verbal. You can go online. You can look it up on a website. So let's say that you're buying, I don't know, nails. You can go to the Lowe's website. You can go to the Home Depot website. You can go to, I don't know, Tractor Supply's website, and you can get three from each of the, one from each of those to have three for comparison. And there are your quotes for your smaller purchase, your micro purchase. Then you evaluate the price. Is it reasonable? Is it not reasonable? And you say, yes, it's reasonable. You sign, you initial beside it that it's the lowest reasonable price, and you're good to go. That's a micro purchase. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. We're asking for a definition of a reasonable scope. So for example, would combining labor and materials into one bid be okay, or do they need to be separated? And then FFA needs to be a separate bid, question mark.
Okay, let's take the first one. So if you are, let's say you're having somebody come in and they are, you know, building a small structure for you, and it's going to cost $6,000. And that individual is going to contract with you, and they're going to provide all the materials, all of the labor, everything you need to be able to complete that entire structure. Okay, then that is one contract. It has one procurement threshold, $6,000. It's less than $10,000. Now, let's say that you're providing the materials and they're just providing the labor. Okay, and the materials are going to cost you $2,000 and the labor is going to cost you $4,000. You would have a procurement for labor from them as a contractor for $4,000, and you would have a procurement from whatever, you know, Lowe's, Home Depot, Tractor Supply for the materials for $2,000. And you would see those two contracts separately. Under most circumstances, you're going to issue a purchase order for those items. And when you do that, it has one person that you're cutting a check for. That is what constitutes that contractual agreement. That's what, and it can be something as simple as they submit you a quote and you sign off on it, and there's your piece of paper that becomes your contractual agreement. Or it can be as much as you're going to bid on a $20 million development and there's enough paperwork for 14 lawyers. Okay, but it doesn't matter. It's about who you are contracting with and what you're contracting with them for. Now, what was the second question?
The second question, okay, would be FFE needs to be on a separate bid, question mark.
I don't know what FFE is.
Okay, thought you may, so we're getting an answer.
Yeah, sorry, that alphabet soup didn't trigger anything.
Fixtures, furniture, and equipment.
Got you. Okay, it really depends. And you're going to hear me say this a lot, the word depends. But when you're talking about those items, if you are in a $250,000 or more category, then you're talking about a full solicitation. And many times you will find that that is put into an addendum because the pricing on that can fluctuate. It can depend on the scope. Now, if you're talking about a small purchase that's between $10,000 and $250,000, then yes, you can put those in there as the total cost. just understand that when you do that, you are then going to be limiting yourself if at some other point you decide that you want to do a purchase. And for many of our organizations that we work with, whether they're housing authorities or cities or counties or whomever, they don't pay tax. And so buying those kinds of especially like equipment, it can be much more cost effective for them to do those purchases themselves, and then that be separate from the contract. But it really starts to be once you get out of the micro purchase and go into somewhat small purchases, but especially when you're talking about sealed bids. So let's come back to that. Small purchases are going to be between 10,000 and 250,000. They are going to require that you do a scope, as well as now you have to do an independent cost estimate. All right, I'm going to go through an independent cost estimate in just a second. They also are going to require that you have a formal solicitation process. So you're going to need a list of where you're soliciting. Are you putting it on the radio? Are you putting it on social media? Are you sending it out via a newsletter? Is it going in the local paper or the local legal organ? You're also going to need to include the actual language of the solicitation. So you want to put in there what your scope is and that you are asking for people to submit bids or proposals for these items by this date. This is how they do it. This is where it goes. And is this a sealed bid process or not a sealed bid process? Remember, small purchases do not require a sealed bid process. If you are not required to do something, I would highly suggest that you not voluntarily increase the complexity and compliance of what you are going for. So typically you will see that people just ask for proposals or quotations for small purchases. You then want to list out everything that you got. If it is under 250,000, so 10,000 to 250, it can be verbal and you can write it down. However, I would encourage you to have them just shoot you an email so that you have it documented. And it can be just that simple. If it is over 25,000, it must be written. I've seen that be emails. I've seen that be handwritten proposals that were dropped off. I've seen that be, full documents that were an inch thick. It just depends on what we're talking about and who's filling it out. However, it needs to be in some sort of physical documented form. And that can take the shape of a quote, which is basically just a list of what they're providing, the cost, any totals, and there you go. It can be a bid where they are actually putting in all of the documentation or being required at one time, or it can be a proposal, which is the lesser than a bid, but more than a quote. It includes the quote as well as some sort of narrative or something that goes beyond that. You will find that in architectural proposals, legal proposals, those sorts of things, that the proposal is typically what you will see. It'll include what their scope is that they're agreeing to. It'll include information on, how they expect to be paid, what their terms are, and then it'll also include the actual, physical quote for what it is that they're doing. It's more than a quote, less than a bid. Okay, so
One more
let's go
question.
to, okay, go ahead.
This group intends to leverage multiple funding sources to complete this project for their non-congregate shelter. Would home procurement standards apply to all expenses incurred over the project? So this is for all levels of what you're talking about, or only for
Sure.
what they use home funds for?
It depends. So
Great.
here's the thing. If you can clearly delineate what sections of construction are being paid for by which thing. Okay, if you have a separate contract, but you got to have a wall, a firewall between everything that has compliance on it and everything that does not. Is it doable? Yes. If you're a larger agency with a good accounting department, or a really good fee accountant, if you're going out to bid with a company that is used to managing these kinds of projects and understands the federal requirements, then it is feasible that you could do that. However, you are taking on a tremendous amount of responsibility for their aptitude and their ability. And if for some reason that wall fails and you commingle funds, you commingle contracts, then you would be looking at having to reimburse for the HOME-ARP funds. So be forewarned that you have to make sure that you know exactly where that dividing line is. And you would have to, I would suggest, and we can run it by internally here, people who are contract people. But I would suggest that you have a separate contract with separate funding mechanisms, or contract documents that specify exactly how those things are going to be firewalled so that you don't commingle funds. Commingling funds is always an audit finding, apparently. So I hope that answered the question. I know we can talk about, if you're awarded, bring that back up and let's have a very, very significant question and answer period on specifics around that. Anything else?
Nope, not at this time. So
Okay.
keep going.
Right.
But that was a good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So next, you have to evaluate. So what do you evaluate? You're evaluating, you're doing a technical and a price evaluation. Did their response match the scope of what you are asking? What is the price that they're proposing? You have to write that up and you have to explain why this technical evaluation and price evaluation are accurate. Typically, it's based on experience. And so I am not a plumber. I don't need to be doing a technical evaluation on plumbing. However, I can evaluate what it costs to buy appliances because I've bought my fair share in the last 12 years, or a truck or that sort of thing. So it really is based on the expertise of the person who is doing the evaluation. Doesn't matter who you get to do the evaluation for you. You have to write up what you did, the amounts, who gave that opinion, and what their background is so that it's justified. Then you have to do a pre-award survey and responsibility determination. I'm going to come back to that as well. Then you can award the contract. And then you issue the contract and the award documents. You issue the notification to anyone who is an unsuccessful bidder or who provided an unsuccessful proposal, and you handle all appeals that may come from that. Your procurement policy always needs to have a due process appeals clause in it for when people challenge the decision.
So Kelly, we have a question that came in regarding the evaluations. Are there any templates for the evaluations that you talked about?
I knew y'all were going to ask that. I can get you some. I don't have any to show you right now because a lot of it is just technical writing, but I can get you some and get them up so that you can see them.
Thank you.
Sure. And then there's the post-award process that you have to go through with the documentation and the payments and all of the compliance before a certificate of occupancy is issued and you make the final payment. Okay. All right, seal bids. It's anything greater than $250,000. And I will strongly caution you that you should proceed with a project manager. Anyone who goes over 250,000 really needs someone who understands the sealed bid process that's required in 2 CFR 200. They need to have experience with federal programming and management of construction projects, specifically when we're talking about HOME-ARP. Not only because of the procurement implications, but also because of the other compliance requirements that are under 2 CFR 200, like minority and Black-owned enterprises, women-owned enterprises, Section 3, Davis-Bacon wage rates. So when you start getting into 250,000, you can start triggering portions that, on top of the procurement responsibilities, it just makes sense to use a project manager. I'm not going to talk about sealed bids. Sealed bids are incredibly difficult on construction projects. They come with a lot of forms that HUD requires under the sealed bid process. And so if you decide that you are not going to procure a project manager under small purchases, so typically you would go out and you would procure a project manager, and the cost of them managing the construction project would fall somewhere between $10,000 and $250,000, and then they manage the sealed bid process for you. They can't bid on it if they're the project manager, and they're managing the process. So if you choose not to do that, if, for example, you decide that the construction company is also going to be the project manager, then you will have to do a sealed bid for both of those things in the scope. And we need to have a conversation about that if you are awarded, to make sure that you understand the compliance and you have someone on your team who's capable of managing that process until you get the project manager from the construction firm on site and working and doing those items for you. Yes, ma'am. You're muted.
Question, will we need to follow procurement process for contracting with a project manager? Or if we use other funds for this activity, will we be okay with standard service contracting processes?
Okay, you know, I'm going to say it depends. However, my personal opinion is that if you are paying for the contract manager with funds that are not federal funds that fall under 2 CFR 200, then you do not trigger procurement guidelines under 2 CFR 200 until you start using those dollars. However, let's go back to the fact that this needs to be a fully ethical and transparent process. So you are still going to have to make sure that the spirit of that is included. As a nonprofit, I would be risk averse to not having some sort of procurement process, and you should have a procurement policy. Your procurement policy does not need to just be for HOME-ARP. It needs to be your agency's procurement policy. And if under your procurement policy, it says that anything under $25,000, you just need one proposal, for example, I would caution you against that as somebody who's ran nonprofits, but let's say you do, and you have private donations that are up to $25,000. Yes, legally, and I'm no attorney, but I can't think of a statute that would trigger until you started spending federal money. But you would still be held to sunshine about that. You would still need to make sure that it was done in a very transparent way that stated that this is the scope, this is what we're asking for, and this is how we're paying for it. And I would write up a justification of why that makes sense. And then I would have my board vote on that to just make sure that I was covered, and that it was done in a way that was completely above board. Is that overkill? Probably. But I'm of the opinion that I'm never going to wear orange for anyone. It's not in my color wheel, and I'm not going to jail for anybody. So I believe that overkill is always a good thing, especially if it doesn't cost you any more money. So that would be my recommendation. Technically, I don't believe that you trigger the requirements under 2 CFR 200 until you get ready to spend, those federal dollars. And so, go ahead.
Well, no, but I mean, the project manager would be enormously integrated into this particular process. So
Right,
wouldn't
but
that
if you're
count for
not
something
paying,
too?
it goes back to, if you're not paying that contractor with those federal dollars, does that then trigger? And on the front end of a project, I think it could be argued that it does not. Ultimately, this is all subject to HUD review. I mean, we all have bosses, and on this grant, DCA's boss is HUD. And it depends on who you're getting as the finance manager at HUD on how they're going to read into this. But on the front end, until you spend the money. Now, having said that, I know for a fact that's not the case with property. You can have property, you cannot pay for it at all with federal funds, but because of all of the regulations that come in with environmental review, that we would not be able to use that property if you did not have the environmental review signed off on. It doesn't matter how you're paying for it. So those are two very different types of procurements, land procurement versus professional services procurement. But I would be really, really careful about how I did that. And once again, you would need to make sure you had an absolute firewall so you knew what funding was paying for what thing. Yeah, when in doubt, go through procurement under federal guidelines.
And we're at 145, just so you know.
I can tell you we're not going to get there. Okay, so here is an example procurement checklist. Sealed bids, competitive proposals, and non-competitive proposals. I would stay away from the last two. Absolutely. I don't care who you are or how robust your finance department or fee accountant is. On the sealed bid, I am not going to get into that because it's so complicated. But on the micro purchase and the small purchase amounts, anything that's white and not grayed out is what you have to have. And I'm going to put this up here, up on our website so that you can get it. It's just a really easy way to go through and check the boxes for what you are, hold on, sorry. So for what you are getting ready to procure. And so what I have always done is I initialed and date the box for when this is done, so that when I'm done, I can just put this on top. It's a checklist. I know that I've accomplished what I needed to accomplish, and it's there. I also wanted to take you through the independent cost estimate. I do have an example of it. It talks about the scope, the proposed work. You can insert your scope here, but you want to look at a detailed cost estimate, examine the price that's being paid and what are the market conditions and inflation. So if you're comparing it to the price you paid for something last year, understand that prices have gone up. And then here's just a really good matrix on each of the items that you're talking about. So you want to break out the labor from the fringe benefits, the materials, any contingency, any profit. so that you know what each item is. And then you want to look at the total cost, which is the estimated value of the contract. That's an estimate. That's not based off of your quotes yet. That's based off internal knowledge of somebody who knows what this is that you're purchasing and about what it should be. And if the quotes you get back are significantly different than this total here that your, in-house expert estimated, you really need to sit down and try to figure out why and go back and recalculate this estimate off of where you were wrong and document all of that. Okay. All right, so we're back to the checklist. Once you do your scope, you're going to go through and you're going to do your solicitation. And like I told you, you're going to go through and you're going to put together your list of where you want to publish it. You want to put your item together that you're going to publish. You want to record whatever bids come in or quotes come in. You want the physical copies of them. Then you're going to go to your evaluation. And under a small purchase, you have to do a technical evaluation. Under both, you do a price evaluation. That independent cost estimate comes in here. Okay, so you're comparing your independent cost estimate to the price that you were given. You're going to write up why you think the prices are reasonable and which price you think is the best price. And then you're going to do a survey on the one that you said was the best price. So let's say that plumber 1 quotes you $12,000. Plumber 2 quotes you $13,000. Plumber 3 quotes you $14,000. All right. Just off of your evaluation report based on price, plumber 1 has the best price at $12,000. You don't look at plumber 2 and 3. You just do a survey of responsibility and reasonableness on plumber 1, who was the lowest actual bid, okay, amount. So what does that look like? Okay, you have to determine, is it reasonable? The amount's reasonable, what they're proposing reasonable, and is the contractor responsible? This is from my previous employment, and what I did was I went in and I looked at, did we do any previous work with this entity? Who did the work and what was the project? I had them list references for who they did business with and what kind of job that they worked on with the contact information. I had to have 2 financial and technical references for the vendor. Let me tell you something, it can be like pulling teeth to get some of this, but you have to determine, can they carry the cost of the project over the life of the project? And so if we're talking about $100,000 and they're only going to get paid once a month, and it's going to take 30 days from when they ask for their payment, they have to be able to float, $20,000, $25,000 per draw. And if they can't do that, then you're going to have a problem. That's one of the reasons why I always ask for either an interview with their banker or a statement of credit worthiness from their banker to let me know that, yes, they had reserves enough or a line of credit enough to be able to handle the cost. I asked them to list any state or local government agency that they had worked with previously. We were closest to Richmond County, so it was always a really good reference point. Hold on, thought there was one more page. Okay, maybe not. But this is a basic chart to get you the information. Then you have to go through and you have to call and you have to verify each one of these things. And if it comes back that, yes, they do have reserves or a line of credit that they can handle it. Yes, they have done this kind of work before and they did a good job. No, they have not ever been debarred, nor has anybody had to go to court for failure to complete a job. Those kinds of questions, then they are considered responsible. So they're proposal was reasonable, and they are responsible, and you stop. Because once you've decided that, yes, the proposal is reasonable and they are capable of doing the job, that is where you stop, unless you're not going to go with the low bidder. Okay, if you're not going to go with the low bidder, then you have to go back and you then have to look at what is their capabilities that make them not as strong an applicant or a contractor as the next person up or the person beyond that. And you start looking at it from a quality perspective of the value that they bring to the job. You can do that. You have to document why you were saying what you were saying. What is it in the expertise of the non-low bidder that means that they are a better contractor for you? And then, does plumber number 2 meet that requirement? If the plumber number 2 meets the requirement and they're going to charge you $13,000, then you don't go to plumber number 3. Okay, because the minute you start trying to compare those 3 plumbers to each other on the whole, you're comparing apples to oranges to bananas. Okay, and you don't want to do that. You want to try to compare your apple to your orange first. And if you don't have to figure out how to compare an apple and an orange to banana, don't. Just say no and keep it to apples and oranges, because that's going to be hard enough. Okay, not going with a low bidder when you're talking about using tax dollars is you have an ethical and moral obligation to make sure that you have the best use of those funds. And if for some reason you're challenged by that, you're going to have to be able to respond and say, yes, I did the hard work. This is what I looked at. This is how I evaluated them. I evaluated them fairly. This contractor exceeded the other contractor, even though the cost was $1,000 more. It was $1,000 well spent to get this extra portion. Okay. This right here, this reasonable and responsible, is a key procurement concept you have to understand and you have to use when you are looking at comparing contractors to each other. And I don't care if it's one contractor has put in a quote for $1,000 and you're not required to get a second quote from anybody else. You still have to make sure that that one quote is reasonable and that contractor is responsible before you enter into a contract with them. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, but if you don't understand anything else I say today, that is very, very important. So after that, you go through and you can award the contract. Here we go. And then you go through the post-award items. Under a small purchase, you're going to make sure that you have all of your documentation here. And this is financial documentation, drawdown request, but it's also federal compliance documentation. Section 3, Davis-Bacon, maybe Weeby. All of those different programs that you're required to do after the contracts are signed are all going to fall in here. That is a whole different presentation for a whole different day. But it's important to know that signing the contract is just the beginning of what you have to do. You think that once you get there, you can take a deep breath, and you probably can for about 30 days, but then you start getting your first straws and it all goes out the window. So that is the micro purchase and the small purchase. If you are getting a grant writer, if you are getting a project manager, and you want to go ahead and get them on board to help you with any of this, and you expect those funds to be reimbursed in any shape, form, or fashion, you have to make sure that you do procurement and that you follow this blueprint to be able to do it. If you have questions, send them to the HOME-ARP email address, send them to me. we will get you answers. I am no procurement expert. There are very few people out there who I think are procurement experts because it's so complicated. However, we can get you your questions answered. We can go to HUD if we need to. We can also go to the attorneys at DCA regarding what our requirements are going to be. So please reach out. It's better that you ask and get an opinion before you spend $1, because that's $1 that you don't want to have to pay back later. And you will, it's probably a question that everybody else has as well. And we'll put it up in the frequently asked questions so that everybody can benefit from the answers, me included. So.
Question.
Sure.
Well, actually, there's kind of two. Oh, we're almost done. Great.
Yeah.
So we had a question about, are you encouraging everyone to go with the lowest bidder because they are understanding that you're indicating it would be very hard to demonstrate or justify going with someone who is not the lowest bidder?
I always, and this is just me personally, this is my preference. I always erred on lowest bid on items. So if I was procuring a good, not a service, I erred on lowest bid. It was very hard to explain to me why one refrigerator was better than the other refrigerator when they both met the scope. Okay. And reasonableness, when you're testing the reasonableness portion, you're looking at, do they both meet the scope? If they don't meet the scope, they're canceled anyway, and you move them off, okay? And you move on to the next one. But if they both meet the scope, it's hard to argue that, you know, this refrigerator and that refrigerator are so completely, unbelievably different that it's worth paying this much more. If you're talking about 10% or that or so, that's not the same thing. I'm talking about an increment that if I had to pay it, write a check out of my pocketbook, I would be like, hold on, you know? And so that's a good. If you're talking about a service, services get really interesting because services are intangible. And it really falls back on the qualifications of the service provider. So for example, let's say that you are hiring an architect to do a schematic for you, okay? Just a very, you know, phase one type of property layout for you and to look at how you can position a building on the property that you're looking at. And you want to determine architect value to architect value. An architect that has experience doing what you are asking them to do is more valuable than an architect that does not. They all are licensed architects. So you know you're starting there when they present you with their license information. But then you want to look at how many years have they been doing it? What have they done previously? Was their design similar to the design concept of what you were looking at? No, I would say that in those instances, you absolutely want to do a qualified assessment, but you want to write it up very concretely. You want to be able to show, and because you're going to need to ask, give me examples of the work that you've done. Let me see pictures of the work that you've done. Let me understand, you know, you're a new architect versus you've been doing this for 20 years. And so you're going to quantify those differences that way to back it up. So it's not based on your perception. I would steer clear of any kind of difference that you could not quantify what it was about it that was significant for you in your decision making. Okay. And if you can't put a value on that, if you can't say he had 5 years more experience, he'd done 3 additional design properties, he had worked with developers in the past, whatever, putting those numbers to it is going to turn that perception into a quantifiable fact, then you're on solid ground. Then you can not take the low bidder.
So kind of looking at it as if you have to defend it.
Yes, always.
some sort of situation, that's usually the best course of action.
Right, because this is tax dollars and it's subject to Agora request. So under the Georgia Open Records Act, any citizen can put in a request and see this documentation. So if the local newspaper puts in a request and gets the documents, and those documents are then tied to tax dollars, you've got to be able to explain to that local paper why you made the decision that you made, why your board backed you on it and approved it. So you know, you always want to cover yourself about that kind of stuff.
Okay. Also, there was some concern about, especially for the smaller nonprofits online, the enormity of this particular process. Kind of some of the things that we are kind of going through at this time.
Sure.
For this, you know, the
It's a big
gravity
deal.
of this. Yeah, just so do you have any kind of easy steps to get started? Obviously, we're going to try and get the information out. So would it be starting with a policy, looking at policies, establishing those if those aren't already there, and then
Yes.
kind of moving from that direction?
Yes. So the first thing you're going to need is you're going to need an ethics policy and a procurement policy. And you can piggyback off of others in the state. We can put examples up, but you can also just Google it. Housing authorities should have really strong ethics policies. They work with federal funds. They should have really strong procurement policies because they work with federal funds. You can also go to your local governmental jurisdiction and ask them to be a fiscal agent on the application with you. If you're a small agency, let's say you are a family connection site that has been using a voucher program to put people in hotels, and it's really expensive, and now you want, excuse me, you want to be able to control that cost by having a shelter. A really good way to expand capacity and capability is to let the local government be your fiscal agent on these grant applications. And they do that. Your local government may not have experience with that, but I'm absolutely positive that they can reach out to either GMA or ACCG, and they can put them with other local governments. We can also go looking at CHIP and see what local governments have received CHIP grants, because they're going to have experience with this. And so they would be able to manage this for you. If I was a small nonprofit that was trying to expand capacity and break into a higher service level by providing this, that would be my go-to. I would be looking for a fiscal agent. Yes, they're going to take a part of the cost, but this is a really good grant for this because we're not asking for a match. And so because we don't have a match on this project, there's a little bit more room for administrative costs in here. And I would rather award a grant to someone who partnered with a fiscal agent with a very deep history of federal compliance and pay a little bit more in the grant fund for that than I would pay less, but put the nonprofit in a situation where they don't have the capacity to do the financials. In fact, I don't think they'll score well on the application we're putting together if that's the case. They're going to have to be able to show that they have experience to get those experience points before we're going to be able to award them federal dollars. So to do that, partnerships are really a good idea. And local government partnerships they're really good at it.
Okay, that's exactly what I wanted everyone to hear. So just to make it all work, so just to reiterate to everyone, please work on those partnerships, work on collaborating with other agencies in your area, and even other referral agencies who would benefit. Everyone is going to benefit from the non-congregate shelters, so trying to get everyone to work together in the area is always a good direction. So we are at 2:06. And so I know we have a meeting right after this as well. So, guys, we're going to go ahead and post this to the site again. It takes us a little bit of time to get everything worked out as far as the logistics and the technicalities. So look for it on that application website by, it should be Monday. I'm going to be working on that. So, and definitely send us any additional questions that you might have to homearp@dca.ga.gov, and we'll be able to get your answers there. Jody is on it with the emails. She's got it going on. So, and I think that's it. So this has been hugely informative. I learned a lot. I did not know some of these things either. So this was great. So, is there anything else, guys? Are we missing anything else? Okay. Look for us on Monday. Look for us on Thursday. It's going to be a big day, and we're personally kind of freaking out about it a little bit, but in a good way. So, so anyway, guys, thanks so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, y'all.
Okay, thanks everyone.